Hello, word nerds! Happy Sunday and welcome back to our live Sunday chat. This is week something of our NaNoWriMo prep series 3. This week we are talking all about plotting and getting your story ready to jump in on November 1st. We know that plotting isn't for everyone, but it is kind of a skill that a bunch of us are trying to work on and get better at. Personally, I always am trying to learn more about plotting, because it's very, very intimidating. So to kick things off, we're going to go down the line and kind of get a sense for how advanced of a plotter all of the word nerds are. So, Erin, how are your plotting skills?
Boy, that's a big question. I think they're always kind of morphing. I do this with plotting and editing. My method is always changing, usually with each new story. Sometimes I think my main thing is I'm what Megan was talking about in a previous video, like an astronaut or an astronaut. So like I'm sort of tethered to something, but I'm still floating around a bit. Like, why did we call it an astronaut? I don't remember. So you've got like a rough outline. So you still like, you're not aimless, but you also have room to just kind of do your own thing a little bit. Because if I overplot, I end up with a very stiff mechanical story and it doesn't work.
Emma?
Yeah, kind of similar. I feel like I am like maybe plotting a little bit more with each story I write. I think it's definitely something that you like when you are a plotter, that you kind of like figure out with every story like a little bit more of what you need to be able to start. But I also do a lot of plotting as I go. So I usually I kind of astronaut for the first like 15 to 20K words. And then like I find once I reach like the like boundary between like Act 1 and Act 2, I usually have a pretty good idea. Like I know more of the plot by then because I know my character better. And so I actually will do a lot of plotting at that point to figure out the rest of the book. So kind of astronaut for the first quarter of the book and then plot for the rest.
Megan, how about you?
I think I'm really similar, but for me, it's like the midpoint of the book. Like once I hit the middle, it's like I need to sit down and write down everything that's going to happen. Generally, I feel pretty confident in my plotting abilities. I have always been a plotter of some sort, and so now I'm more trying to focus on ways to plot my novel such that I can like deepen the plot and like try and implement more intense like character arcs and stuff that usually I end up not figuring out until revisions, which is really hard. I mean, it's always hard, but I'd love to know before like going into a book what those things are going to be. So that's what I'm working on now.
I guess I'm not that dissimilar either. I'm trying to be more of a plotter, but mostly I have kind of a beginning and an end point, and I know where I want to go. And then I'm always just plotting kind of what I want to write that day in more specifics of like actual plot points in each chapter I want to write or whatnot. But I would love to get to the point of like thoroughly fleshing out a novel before I jump in, so I can hit all of those like more nuanced beats and actually have like a more advanced plot. And it also, every time I stall out in writing and every time I'm like blocked or whatever, it's because I don't know what's happening next. So I'm trying to be better at that, because it always gets me into trouble without fail.
Same. Yeah.
I've spent the last week purely just on plotting because I just reached like around 20K in my novel, and like I spent the whole week plotting instead of writing because I could not write any words because I was like, I don't know what happens after this point. Like once the character makes the decision, like I know generally, but I didn't know like what the next scene should be, or like I didn't know what was going to happen in like the whole next part of the story. So
yeah, if I'm ever blocked, like I never get writer's block unless I haven't plotted out what happens next. Or like or maybe I have and it's not like, it doesn't feel natural anymore. It's not right. Yeah, that's the only time I get blocked.
Yeah. And I will say, I usually,
go ahead.
I would say I do like, because I was saying like I do a lot of my plotting like after the first plot point going into like Act 2, but I do tend to like at every major plot point I kind of like stop and like assess like what I have coming next. Because like sometimes you get to the midpoint and you're like, oh, like what I had planned, like you've deviated some from your plot and you need to like readjust. So I try to like reevaluate and readjust to each of those spots.
I don't know if anyone else does this, but I recently, and especially with my last manuscript, the one I'm currently editing right now, like I really intensely plotted things out. And then I found I just strayed from the plot line, and like so many of my edit notes are like drop plot line, drop plot line, drop plot line. Because I just like, if I have too many subplots, I feel like even if I plot them out at the time, I like almost forget them, or I don't know. So I end up doing almost some plotting and putting back in what I had plotted before in the edits. You guys are nodding, so maybe it's not
No, I definitely, when I was doing all this plotting this week and figuring things out, I like went back and made notes like combine these things together, or like move the, you know, like switching around some things. But I think it's helpful, like even like the things that I plan on doing and then end up don't doing or having to cut, like I think writing those things helps me figure out the rest of it. Like doing the wrong thing helps me figure out the right thing sometimes.
Yeah, totally. I'm actually doing Susan Dennard's method of editing right now, including all of the scene outlines where it's like, oh my God, it's so intense, but it's so good for me because I'm going through and I'm doing the, you know, where you write out each scene on a cue card and you're like, what's the goal? Antagonist, protagonist, goal, and conflict. And I'm finding so many flaws in the thing that I plotted originally, because I'm like, so many of my scenes that I had plotted don't have a goal or a conflict. Like I thought they did, but really they don't. Or they need a more clear one, you know? So
I struggle with that a lot on a scene level.
Yeah.
Like these things need to happen, but they're not that interesting because there's no conflict.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Or there's no like, there's no concrete goal necessarily, which results in my character being kind of floating around and she doesn't really have proper motivation. So yeah, I mean,
I find those are a lot of information scenes where it's like my character needs to get this information.
Yes.
And so you have them like go to a tavern and sit down and talk to someone. And you're like, this is important information, but how can I make it more interesting?
Yeah, that's
like,
I'm
it
finding
has
that
to be
too.
in here, but like finding a good way to do it is really difficult for me.
Yeah, especially in fantasy, I find, because there's so much that like, oh, you need to know this. It's this big chunk of information. And when I'm plotting, I'm like, how do I convey this information without being like, yes, you know, Bob, or like, you know, that type of thing.
There was a course I did a while ago that covered a bunch of different topics, but they did have like a master outline for plotting that they encouraged you to use. So it's like for every single chapter, it wanted you to have an opening hook and a closing hook and a conflict. And then there were kind of optional ones like a mundane task, like something kind of normal that they're doing while they're giving you information, like that just kind of shapes the world and shows you character life while giving things like the info, or is something happening with the love interest plot line, or so is kind of giving you different points to hit, but making sure you had conflict in all of them and an opening and closing hook to keep people reading throughout.
I love stuff like that, and I don't like, if I, like I said, if I go lean into it too much, it becomes very mechanical and stilted, and you can tell that I've overplotted it. But I like to have like the bare bones to hang the story on, basically, because otherwise I get this like story and these scenes that are flat, and I'm like, oh, there is no goal, there is no conflict. If I haven't plotted out, I'm just sitting down, and they're like, oh, they're at a coffee shop now. You know, they're talking. Well, nothing happens. So yeah, I like that kind of structure where somebody's guiding you and saying, well, what's the goal? What's the purpose of this scene? And yeah, I like that.
Yeah. I think the purpose of that particular outline was addictive writing. So kind of like keeping people always with you from
turning
chapter
pages.
to chapter, which is
I like that.
A solid focus. So
especially with some of the genres we write in YA and children's fiction, you have to keep it interesting. It's not like the adult novels where it's like, oh, they're going on a quest, they're traveling for 15 pages.
Or like George R. R. Martin, let's talk about every piece of food on the table.
Yeah. No, you have to just go and keep them turning pages. Yeah.
And I find too that that's like, if I am stuck, a lot of times it's because I'm really bored and I know this thing needs to happen, but I don't know. And it matters a little less in November because it's like, it's November, you're writing fast, you can just info dump and fix it later. But I definitely get stuck a lot on those.
Yeah.
I do also find sometimes that when I have, like a chapter where not much is happening, but I have information, a lot of times I can like combine a couple of scenes together. Like, I don't know, like, it's like, I'm like, this is the scene where they get information, and this is the scene where they confront this. And I'm like, but I could just combine it all. And then you get the information and it's more interesting. So sometimes that helps too.
Yeah, it'd be nice to like be able to go through my plot line and recognize that right off the bat.
Yeah, I have to write it before I can recognize it.
Yep, every time. I would love to get to a point of plotting where, like, I have friends that do this and it makes me so jealous, but writer friends that can literally sit down, plot something out, and then write a rough draft that's like almost perfect plot-wise. Like the pacing is all good, the plot makes sense, and the characters are doing things that make sense with their motivations, and I'm just like, how do you plot?
I'm just like shaking my head. No.
See, I feel like I could
like
do
a hot
that.
mess.
Plotting is more my problem. Like the patience for plotting. Like I just want to get going, or I usually like I'll put off plotting for too long, but now I'm up against a deadline and I just have to start. So like if I could really give myself time to like thoroughly plot, I feel like I could do the attention to detail thing and work through pacing and all of that.
I thought that too, but I still plotted everything and then ended up just going so off track. It's not good.
See, I almost have the opposite problem, a little less so now. I'm a little better at letting myself go off track if it feels right. But when I wrote my first few novels, probably the first like 3 or 4 novels, I plotted them really intensely, and I felt like I have to stick by this plot. And then revising them was impossible because I had created this plot, and it was like, character motivations don't matter. I need them to be in this place right now. And it's like so hard to fix something like that.
That is the problem sometimes. I feel like when I start over plotting is I'm like, well, you know, it doesn't make sense anymore, but I'm like married to this plot, and like, no, I just need to throw it out. Start over.
One thing I do no matter how I've prepped my novel is kind of adapt my plan as I go. Like each day I kind of look at, okay, this is what I'm supposed to be doing, but does any of this not make sense?
Right.
So just kind of don't stick to your outline as like the holy grail of this was what happened. Look at what you've already done and then how that affects what happens in the future.
Yeah, that's why I think I have to like not plot quite as rigorously so that I just give myself more wiggle room. But
one of the things I've started doing more now in trying to get like a more character-driven plot is I've started with character. Like I get to know my character first, figure out like who they are, what are they afraid of, what do they want, and then I do the same thing for my villain. And then I sit down and I just put like a big line down a sheet of paper or down like one of my whiteboards or whatever, and I just start by thinking like, okay, so if my hero does this, what does my villain do? And then when my villain does that, what does my hero do? And just kind of like zigzag back and forth until I hit like a big midpoint that would be like, oh my God, how do I even recover from that? And then I like take a breather.
See, that's interesting because I do a lot of that after my first draft. Like my plotting continues, it's before I do the draft, and then I continue plotting almost because I don't know a character until I've actually written the manuscript. Like I don't have any idea usually, usually they start with like a base motivation, but I don't really know them until afterwards. And so I feel like a lot of my plotting actually does come after I've drafted, if that makes any sense. Maybe that's just like making the process so much longer, but that's how my brain works. So
the process is long no matter what you do.
We had a question about the index card thing that I was talking about, and that's on Susan Dennard's website. She's the author that wrote the Truth Witch series. So if you just go to susandennard.com, I think it is, and then click on For Writers, you can find like all of her articles about writing, including editing, and she's just like outlines that in detail. So yeah, that really helps lay it out for me.
She's a very organized and detailed reviser. So.
Yeah, which I feel like I need. Yes, my brain is so like scattered at the best of times, never mind when I'm revising, that I find the way she lays it out to be helpful to keep myself organized. So
I'm putting a link in the discussion section to it.
I think it helps that she's like a former scientist, so like, I don't know, she's like very methodical. So
yeah, I was gonna say my brain is so far from that, so it's good to have someone else like outline the whole. This is how you should revise. Thank you.
I love that because I feel like as artists or whatever, I shouldn't put air quotes around it, but as artists, it feels like, oh, well, this is art. Like, there's not a science to it, but like literally everything is science. There is a scientific way to like
Which
look
is
at these
horrible.
things and make them better. I love it. That comforts me.
Oh God, no. That scares me. I hate the idea of anything being mathematical in relation to writing. I'm like, no, I refuse. But like, I still need to use this formula.
See, I'm like afraid of the idea that like the only way I could get something good is by throwing a million spaghetti noodles at the wall and just hoping that one of them sticks.
Oh my God, give me the spaghetti. It's so much easier. Just throw stuff. I can do that.
So how much do you guys know plot-wise before you let yourself write the first page? Like how much of your plot, if it's this nano that you're doing or if it's like a past nano that you've done, how much of the plot did you know before beginning?
Nano's a little different for me. I don't know as much as I usually do. Normally I plot out more, but with Nano, some of the time I just like have a, like Kelly said, like a beginning, middle, and end. So I know where I'm going.
I almost always know like the major plot points at least. Like I do like the 4-part story structure and I'm like, these are my plot points and my pinch points and a general idea of what's happening in each. But yeah, so I mostly need to know that and I need to know like the first few scenes, like what happens for the whole beginning part. At very least, I need something to get started with. So
yeah, pretty much the same.
Yeah. I feel like there's a lot of stuff that I can be okay with not knowing yet, but I really, really like to know my opening chapter, like for sure.
Oh,
and I know that a lot of people aren't that way, and they're like fine to revise it. But in every book I've ever written, my opening chapter has like stayed the same because that's always the one I'm most confident about. Like I know exactly where the action starts.
Yeah.
I'm actually
sometimes I write the first scene and then I plot everything else.
Actually, I usually do that too. Yeah, because normally the kind of beginning conflict is the inciting incident. Is like what occurs to me first a lot of the time. Like when I have an idea, I start in my head with a really great, exciting, inciting incident, and that's how chapter 1 usually close to starts. So, and then usually I know where that's going from there, and then after that I get kind of stuck and then need to start plotting.
Sometimes like writing the first scene is kind of like, it's just like kind of an exercise for me to like get the character's voice, make sure this is something I actually do want to write, like kind of figure some stuff out. So it kind of helps sometimes.
Yeah, I think the characters can like surprise you that way. Like the book I'm drafting right now, in my head when I plotted it, I very much wanted the two like best friends or whatever to have a very Hamilton and Burr-esque relationship. And in my head, it was like, okay, well, the point of view character is very obviously the Hamilton and the other one is very obviously the Burr. It's fine. I know the plot. Like, that's obvious. And then I wrote the first scene and it was like, oh, wait, I have it backwards. Because, like, the words, I hate to say they just came out different than I anticipated, but putting a character that I had imagined in that scenario, knowing what I knew about them, they responded differently than I had initially thought they would.
I definitely had that happen before too, where, like Emma said, you kind of almost write the chapter 1 or the inciting incidents. You actually want to continue. Like, do I like this enough that I want to dedicate so much time to it? And I've done that before, where I've had like an idea that I thought was cool, and then I wrote chapter 1 and went, you know what? I'm not eager to return to this, and I've ended up putting it aside because I just don't want to dedicate that much time to a full novel. So I don't know. I do like the idea of writing that first chapter and then going, okay, I'm dedicated to this. Let's plot this out.
We had a question from Courtney asking, any advice for a plotter who's writing fantasy for the first time? I have a vibrant fantasy world I want to write. I just don't know about magic/world building and how to incorporate it with the plot.
That's the kind of thing where I like, to an extent, to let that evolve as the story does. So as you're plotting or as you're writing, like, once you have rules, you need to stick to them, but figure out what is going to either add the most conflict to your story or what is going to make the most sense with the society that you created. That kind of thing of, there's some room to play around to see official to the story that you're writing. So I wouldn't make it too set in stone beforehand. Like,
Yeah,
it's not necessarily going to need yet.
Yeah, I do actually, when I do fantasy, like I don't actually usually do high fantasy usually, but when I have, you know, written some of it before, there's like actual questionnaires you can take online. They're like, oh, you know, tell me about the customs in your fantasy world and what about this and this and this, which is good to a point because I feel like you can get so hung up on that, like Kelly said, you don't really need to have it in cement yet, or you can also use that to put off ever writing it. I know writers that literally just like they're like, oh, this is the world, and it's like so incredibly detailed, and I'm like, oh, have you finished the book yet? No, I've been writing it for 10 years. Okay, all you're doing is creating the world. So I mean, there needs to be a balance. You need to know enough that you can write or start the story, but like I don't think there's anything wrong with it while you're doing it.
And by not overdoing it, it makes it easier to avoid info dumping, and you're also leaving doors open for yourself in the future. Like if the first Harry Potter book, there'd been some rule just randomly thrown in that you can't do anything with time, and then all of a sudden you can't write the third book, and like, so just give yourself what you need.
Yeah. I like to be sure too that I come up, even if I don't know like every little thing about the magic system and it is going to come to me, I like to make sure I know at least some limitations of the magic system, like some things. Desiree!
I was like out of the screen and I just heard Megan scream.
I had to stop everything I was saying.
Heart attack.
What was I saying? Oh, yeah, coming up with a limitation of the magic system. That way, like I know there are some things I'm just not going to be able to do because I always hate when magic swoops in at the end and it's like, Deus Ex Machina or whatever. Like, aren't we glad that this magic system didn't have any limitations in place?
Yeah, and I'll say, like, even things that I do know about the world, a lot of times don't make it into the first draft because I'm so focused on, like, plot and character that, like, there's a lot of stuff already, like, only 20,000 words into my current manuscript. There's so much stuff that I'm like, oh, I forgot to mention, like, all of the stuff about the world building that you need later. So I'll just add that in a second draft, you know, so.
Future Emma's problem.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't worry about it too much for drafting. Like, figure out what you need to know for your story. Like, yeah, the limits of the magic, or like if it's got a lot of politics, then know some things about how the politics work. But things that aren't super important that like you don't necessarily need to know right now, just don't worry about too much, and you'll figure it out as you go.
Yeah.
And the great thing about Nano is it's word count based. So as you're figuring it out, if you're like, I'll just put this information here, you can write as much of that information as you want. And A, it's still writing. B, it's figuring out your plot. And C, it adds to your word count.
And you can spread it out later. But yeah, yeah, you don't necessarily need, I always think it's interesting and kind of fun to go through these types of questionnaires is like, oh, what are the customs? What are their, like when they sit down to eat, what's considered super rude and what's considered normal? And like, is it different than our thing? And those are the types of things that are super interesting, but you don't necessarily need them right away. You can figure them out later and put like their holidays and stuff, put those in later. It's just the big things you need, like Megan said, the limitations on their magic, like things that'll affect like your major plot, right?
I also say, even among high fantasy novels, there are different levels of world building. Like, not every fantasy novel is Game of Thrones or Lord of the Rings, where you know, like, every little custom and every little thing. Like, I'm not a super detailed world builder. Like, I know the basics, and other than that, like, I'm just like, oh, this is like our world, whatever. Like,
and that's totally okay. Like, even outside of our world, like, because Lord of the Rings is what it was, a lot of fantasy readers assume some basic things, even about worlds that are completely non-existent. Like, you can just say elves at this point. We'll know what those are.
Yeah.
Well, some fantasy books too are more focused in, like the lens isn't drawn as back, so you can't see like all of the stuff that's happening in the world. It's, you know, focused on a couple of characters and their magic or what have you. So, and I like those ones. I personally like those better than I have to remember 62 different names in all of the different countries. And
I think that's a particular big difference between like age categories, like adult fantasy versus young adult fantasy. Young adult tends to be much more character focused.
Yeah. Which is why, you know, like I grew up reading like Robert Jordan, Wheel of Time, and like Terry Goodkind, sort of, or in the Sort of Truth series, and like all of these different things. And I like them, but I think I burnt out on them, like the intense world building in them. So I've never really had the desire to, I think that's why I'm so drawn to YA now, because it's so much more focused, and I don't have that, you know, need to create these huge fantasy worlds and systems. I'm just like, I'm done with those for a while.
It has like, I guess Sarah J. Maas is the big one.
Yeah, but even her world is not as ridiculously complicated and
grows
massive.
Every book. So
it does.
Book one, you're not explaining every single political thing that's ever happened. And
Exactly, yeah. And you don't get those big chapters of like, there was this war and then these people attacked these people, and it's definitely YA still. Yeah.
We had a question from Die Facing Our Foes. Where does plotting fall for y'all in your development process? I usually do character first because character determines plot, then world building and fantasy, then plot. But I'm unsure how much to world build. It's stressing Kelly up.
I heard someone said something about this recently. I think it was the Victoria Schwab First Draft podcast. Is this like she was talking about building the world, and then kind of her characters are always outside of. This needs to like spark something for someone, because I'm never gonna get there. She
talked about how she like creates a world, and then she creates a character who's incongruent with the world.
Yeah,
a character who doesn't fit in.
Because as much as like characters drive your story, if your character was shaped by the world, like I think I would need to start there.
Yeah, for sure.
It differs a little bit story to story for me.
Yeah.
My current book, I started with the world, because the first idea I had was for the world and for the magic system, and then I figured out a character that like how she fit into that system. But I have had ones that had started with a character, and then I figured out the world that they're in. It just kind of depends.
It definitely depends on what you're writing, I feel like, and on the genre you're writing. I'm always writing fantasy, but a lot of my fantasy lately has been set in the real world. Like I said, it's not a high fantasy. It's not a different world. It'll be like London, England, but with like weird monsters in it, right? So like, I don't necessarily need to start with a world. A lot of the time I can start with like an incident or a character. Maybe it's different with fantasy, like Fi Schwab was saying, because like obviously the character is going to be so shaped by that world. But for me, a lot of the times it's an inciting incident, or like something that catches my eye that's like, oh, what if this thing happened? It's usually something that has occurred rather than like a character or a world.
Yeah. I agree with that. Like when I write, it's usually when I get an idea, it's like the moment that the story is about to take off is the first thing I think of.
Inciting incident for sure. It's the most exciting thing.
Yeah, it is.
For me, I think
I wish I was better with inciting incidents.
Yeah.
Like I know my current work in progress that I'm gonna have to like. I love the first scene, but I'm gonna have to revise it because there's just not enough of like conflict or inciting incident at the beginning. Like, so I'm like, ugh. I don't even know what it's going to be. But I'm like, I gotta figure out something.
Yeah, it's funny because I usually do start, like, that's usually how I get the idea, and it's usually what I immediately start with. Like, there's not a lot of backstory, there's not a lot other going on. It's like with Bryony Gray, literally she paints someone and it comes to life and like shit hits the fan, right? That was the first thing I thought of, is paintings that come to life and tear themselves out of the campus and rampage through London. I'm like, that's so cool, I'm gonna write that. But with the one I just wrote, I actually did start with a character for once, which I never do. And like Megan's read it, it starts off really slow. And I realized this. This is why I want to keep you with me. Just because I started with a character instead of the inciting incident. So the character's like, oh, I have this going on in my life and I'm at school right now. And and I read it over as I'm doing revisions and I'm like, this is really slow. And I would be bored if I was reading this book. So I have to chop a bunch of it and start with the inciting incident. So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think if you're not going to start like right on top of the inciting incident, it has to be a scene that like really strongly shows character or world in a way that like you're just not gonna get the character or the world if it doesn't start right there.
Something just like, sometimes it's the voice. Like sometimes I'll start chapter 1 on somebody else's book and the voice is so compelling that I can't put it down. But normally, even if that's a thing, the inciting incident comes up pretty fast after that. Yeah.
We had a question. Thank you so much for everyone's questions, first of all. If we miss it, please re-ask it. I think if you like put @WordNerds, it highlights it orange. And then I'm more likely to see it. I think I'm getting them all, but stuff happens. Tesla asked, would you guys plot a whole series first or just the first book in a series? Write the first book, then plot out the rest of the books?
Well, Kelly will have a totally different answer than I will. But if I'm traditionally publishing the series, I will never plot it out. Well, I will not plot it out intensely. Like when I deliver a book to my publisher, they are going to probably, if it's say a 3-book series, they're going to want the first one, and then they're going to probably want like an outline of the next 2. But because they could say like, we want you to change all of these things, if I've already intensely plotted out book 2 and 3, I'm going to just have to change it all anyways. So for me personally, I would just have a very bare bones outline for the rest of the series, or just like even just a general idea, and then I won't plot it out more intensely until they're like, hey, can we have a small synopsis for book 2 and 3? So that's how I do things. It's going to be different if you are just writing for fun, or if you're like Kelly and you're like pumping out all these indie titles.
And I think Megan's the big one here because she's breaking all of the what you're supposed to do rules.
Yeah, I think you have to know the rules. So like with the book that is out with my agent right now, I wrote the first one. I plotted the first one out pretty intensely when I began writing it, and I just knew sort of generally that I would want it to be a duology. And I knew a little bit of like, okay, well, if this is where I'm going to end it, then, you know, here's like a back of the book blurb of what would want to happen, what I would want to have happen in book 2. And that, like, my agent had me write out that blurb basically to give to editors for when we're on submission. But conversely, I don't know if you guys have heard, but Kyra and I wrote a book. We never talk about it. So,
is it about Vikings? I feel like it's something.
Yeah. And for that, we pants the whole thing. So that book was a hot mess. We knew it needed to be a trilogy, but we like figured out the world as we went. And so for us, we ultimately decided to keep going and like actually write out books 2 and 3, which is basically like a 70,000 word synopsis of all the things we would like to do in book 2 and 3. And for that book, knowing that it's going to be a while before that project is even ready to do anything, it's turned out to be really useful since it was all pantsing and we were figuring everything out. It was just like, oh, look, here's this thing we might want to do in book 2. Better lay some groundwork in book 1. But the most important thing for that is, like, we know the rules. We're not going to revise books 2 or 3 because, like, we could have to just rewrite everything. And we're fine with that. And so, like, if you're fine with that, like, know the rules don't get too attached to anything, and you'll be fine.
I'd have to say it really depends on how interconnected everything is going to be between your books. Like, if you need to be laying a lot of groundwork for later books in the first one, then you'll want to have a little bit more, like, figured out of what's going to happen in the series. So.
Yeah, I do think that, like, it is important to have, if you're going to have a 3-book series or something, you have a vague idea, I do think it's important to have an idea of what's happening in book 2 and 3, especially because I'm not naming any names, but there are some very big authors that their publishers have said, hey, book 1 was a great success, let's do a 2nd and 3rd book. And then the 2nd book suffers from book 2 syndrome, which is just like, it's so flat and it's almost like, oh, they really tacked this on. Where did this plot come from? Or, like, it's just like an interlude between book 1 and book 3, basically. And there's some really big series out there that suffer from book 2 syndrome that I've almost just put down, because you can tell that book 2 is just like, it's like they're waiting. Yeah, it's like a bridge between 1 and 3, and you're like, this is, Yeah,
you're like, 1 had a really cool concept, and 3 is going to have the big major conflict.
Yes, and then 2 is just like killing time.
It's a lot of the character just learning a bunch of information and deciding what they're gonna do.
And like usually like traveling from one place to the other for some reason. Now they're here, now they're there, now they're here, and I'm like, but why?
And like joining up with different groups. So like they're like, I'm part of this rebellion, now this rebellion, now never mind, those guys are bad. Like, oh my God.
So much, yes.
But I also would say a good thing to know about future books would be if you're going to be having any major, like, reveals in them, like any big surprises, because you want to make sure that it's going to make sense. So, like, if you know something's going to be revealed about a character later in another book, then, like, you need to leave the groundwork so that, like, when you do it in book 3, like in the last book of the series, it's not like, but that doesn't make sense with what happened in book 1. That was contradicted, you know?
Yeah, or that came out of nowhere, because if you don't lay the groundwork for something and you're like, oh, surprise, she was secretly a god. You're like, where did that come from? You know, something like J.K. Rowling.
3 different books where this
You never know. But, you know, it's like J.K. Rowling, who clearly plotted out all 7 of her books, because you read 1 and then you read the 7th book and you go, holy crap, something that she mentioned in book 1 now makes sense. So, like, definitely you want to have some foresight.
But also in terms of conflict, those books are so good to look at. Of like, yes, there is the overarching Voldemort thing, but each book has its own. Hunger Games does it really well as well. Of like, each book has a set little conflict bubble that feeds into the whole.
And also, like, a good lesson from those is some of those little things that she sets up that, like, become major things later. If she had decided not to do those major things, you wouldn't have noticed. Like, if she had never, if she had changed her mind about Horcruxes and decided not to do the Horcrux storyline, you never would have known any different. Like, you never would have been like, but what about that diary thing? You know, she didn't leave it open-ended. It wasn't like, there's something more about the diary, you know? She just let you think it was the diary, whatever.
Which is why, like, I often speculate when I'm talking about Harry Potter to other fans, like, if she, because I know she did plot a lot, but I do wonder if some of it was like her going back to book 1 and being like, I want to pull something from this.
I know that the Horcruxes she had planned all along, because originally she was going to talk about the Horcruxes in book 2.
Okay.
Because I remember when Half-Blood Prince was coming out, one of the things she teased was that like one of the major storylines was going to be related to something in book 2, and she's like, it's a storyline that I had in book 2 and then I cut. And there's still like a fragment. There's still a fragment left in book 2.
She teased you more than we knew.
But like, I wonder if, like, book 2 polyjuice potions was ever directly going to be book 4 polyjuice potions.
Oh, definitely. Probably not.
Right.
Yours in book 6 and like that kind of stuff. I doubt she did all of that.
Yeah, and that's comforting to me, actually, to think that, like, J.K. Rowling can go back and be like, I'm going to pull this at book 1 and make it make sense in book 7, because you too can do something that makes you look like a genius, right? Like, I can do that too, and everyone will think that I plotted it, and I didn't.
One of my favorite moments of when I took a creative writing class in college was we did these things where we would share our short stories with each other, and then we would arrange the class, like all the desks, into a circle. And we would all just talk about the person's work, like what we thought about it, what we liked, what didn't work for us as well. And the whole time, the author was not allowed to say anything until the very end. They were allowed to ask any questions, or if like there were questions we brought up a lot, then they could answer it. And this one guy, he'd written this short story that I still think is brilliant. And I absolutely loved it. Everyone in the class loved it. We spent like a full 30 minutes just like analyzing this guy's work and what he thought, or what we thought he meant, and what the symbolism was. And we got to the end and he was like, yeah, I just thought it would be fun to like have him fall off of that cloud at the end. I didn't mean for you guys to get all this deep stuff out of it.
But it's awesome that way readers do.
I feel that way about a lot of Harry Potter stuff, because people have overthought some things in that series. Like they open these whole, like that whole thing about like the like different like herbs that Snape mentions in the first book, and they're like, he's saying he regrets Lily's death, and I'm like, I really don't think he had that planned, you guys.
There's definitely some over reading into things for sure. But people will always do
I get annoyed every time I see that theory. I'm like, I really don't think that's.
But you also have to think like every book you ever had to like analyze in high school, like how much of those little nuanced things did the author actually put in there, or just like bored English teachers being like, yes, this is relevant.
This clearly symbolizes his deep inner self-hatred. And it's like he's eating scrambled eggs. Like,
and there also are, I think there are things that you do subconsciously in a story too. You know, where something is symbolizing death, and you're not even like realizing that that's what you're doing.
Sure.
You know.
Yeah.
So
for sure.
Definitely some of that happens subconsciously, but sometimes, some of it is also just readers going way too far.
I actually
writers don't put that much attention to little tiny things like the herbs that Snape mentions, which is like, let me find an herb that represents death and lilies and regret, and I'm like, okay.
Well, you never know with J.K. Rowling, but I sincerely
this is
true. That. But yeah, no, I do find that like quite often when you're writing, you're like, oh, I want to put in this because it just feels right. And you don't necessarily know until someone is like, hey, does this symbolize this? And you're like, oh, yeah.
Yes, it does.
It does. I did that deliberately. Yeah. But, you know, often you're unconscious. The artist part of you probably does recognize that, hey, this needs to come full circle, or hey, this would have so much more meaning if this happened, and you're just like, well, this would be cool, and you don't realize until later that it actually is deep.
We have a plotting related question from Shanice. What do you do if you have abstract ideas but no plot?
Plot.
That's what I was
so helpful.
Depending on how you mean the question, I would say in a lot of cases that's a story that's not ready yet. Like maybe that you have another idea that's a little more fleshed out and ready to go, and that one needs to simmer a little bit longer. But just taking the time to plot it is also a totally valid option.
Yeah, I think there's definitely something to be said for just sitting down and being like, okay, this is my list of ideas that I have, like what am I gonna make from it? And it's okay to like get started thinking like, okay, well, this is what I want my character to be, this is a flash of the world that I've had, how can I make the character most miserable in this world? And you can like kind of follow that rabbit hole a little bit, and if you don't like it, you can start over.
That's how a lot of my go ahead, Erin.
No, you go ahead.
I was gonna say that's how a lot of my stories start out. Like I'll have like a good like 15 like things that I want to happen. When I like go to outline, I'm like, I don't know, like how does one plot? I don't know. So I just make it interesting, if that makes sense. Like make bad things happen to the characters you love the most and write them out of situations.
Yeah, I like what Kelly said too, because I actually made a video on this a while ago called "Let It Steep," like where I compare like such a long time ago. I compare an idea that's kind of like abstract to like the tea. Like you need to let the bag soak for a while, or you're gonna have this weak, watery tea, and it's not gonna do it for you. So like when I have an idea that's more abstract, I do sort of sleep on it. I'll go for a few days at least to be like, is this idea persistent enough that I'm going to want to dedicate so much time to it? Like usually I know if the idea continues to come back to me and I obsess over it, then it's going to be long enough for me. I'm going to like it enough to write it, essentially. And then also it does help because I think your idea will continue to evolve the more you think about it and the more you like hold off on writing it. Because I know when I hold off on writing something, I'll obsess over it. And then I'll think about it more and it develops more. And so.
And it makes it easier once you do get to the point where it's time to write that if it has
Exactly.
had to sit for a while.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I like to, in the letting it steep phase, I keep a note card at my desk just like all the time that is like anytime I think something that's like, oh, that would be cool, I could add that to it, I write it down immediately. So I just have it like right there, and then once I've filled up like 1 or 2 note cards, it's like, okay, I've got enough stuff now that I could probably guess at what a good plot would be. I would also, I kept this book right next to my desk because I knew I would recommend it in this chat, The Anatomy of Story by John Truby. It's so good, you guys, so intense, and you can even see, like, I'm going through the exercises right now, so I don't know if you can see it because of the white balance, but I have, like, my bookmark in there doing the exercises, and this book actually walks you through, like, from the moment you have an idea to actually creating, like, a fresh, deep plot that's going to resonate with people. So, like, you don't have to have a million ideas of how to make your plot super strong. Like, this will help you get there. So I cannot recommend it enough. It's The Anatomy of Story by John Truby.
How do I always end up buying something on Amazon in these chats? Like, every time you guys talk about a book, I immediately open my Amazon tab, and I'm just like, I need to buy that. I need that.
Why am I going so broke after every WordNerd chat?
The real reason Desiree has missed some chats. So she's just like, I just can't afford
Yeah,
that.
money. Yeah.
This is why.
Yeah, and it's actually originally written about screenplays, so it's double useful to you.
See, now I have to buy it.
Oh no, now Desiree has to open Amazon.
Curse you, Megan.
I gotta buy that too. Every time I see a writing book, I'm like, well, that's gotta make my book perfect.
I have to read the books already on my shelf before I buy any more writing books.
Right, I'm the same way. I still haven't got through Save the Cat. I need to finish that before I'm allowed to buy anything else.
I haven't even finished Wonder Book, and I love Wonder Book. It's just, there's so much.
I love the idea of writing books. Like, I see it and I'm like, yes, that'll make me a better writer. And I'm like, I'm going to take this craft seriously and I'm going to read through the whole thing and memorize it. And then it's like, I'll get 5 pages in and be like, well, I kind of want to read this other novel instead. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm trying to go through.
There's so many questions.
Yeah, you guys have such great comments and discussion going on in the discussion section.
The Kindle edition of that book is only $10 right now, in case anybody is wondering.
It's not even a question.
If anyone is curious, that's how much it costs right now.
You gotta do it. She is on Amazon. I love it. You're not even joking.
I wasn't kidding. Like, I was 100% serious.
That's great.
Someone asked for the link, so I'm getting that and putting it in the discussion section right now.
The paperback's only a little bit more. It's $11.95, so
yeah.
You know.
Oh, worth it. I like my paperback, and then I can highlight like the points that I really like a lot.
Writing books, it's really nice to have the paperback because it's easier to go back and reference something too. When you're like,
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, if you are interested in more like plot helping books, but you maybe don't have $10 to spend, Holly Lyle, Lisle, I'll get the link for this as well, but she runs a 99-cent plot workshop that comes with an ebook that similarly helps walk you through like having just a bud of an idea to getting a full fleshed out unique story. And that comes with like worksheets and stuff as well that I have found really useful. I'll get the link for that too.
Does Beth Revis have a plotting book? I feel like she
I
does.
think Paper Hearts, one of them is, one of them's plotting.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of them. Yeah, because I think she has it on Wattpad. If you find Beth Revis on Wattpad, some or all of it is on there. I don't know.
My favorite plotting book is called Take Off Your Pants by Libby.
Yes, I love that book. I bought that book,
then.
like right when I first got into writing. That was like one of the first books I bought because it was on sale for 99 cents. And I just feel like
it's not too expensive.
Yeah, like I still to this day, like whenever I like outline, I always reread that book.
Yeah.
I'm trying to imagine like reading that in public. What are you reading?
Although there's like underwear all over the cover. So.
Yeah, there is.
Wow.
Good read.
Funny.
Great book.
Ugh, now I have to write that one down too. Dang it. I am gonna go broke after this stuff.
NaNoWriMo also has a book called No Plot, No Problem that is pretty inexpensive, I think. Holly's website is all different.
The No Plot, No Problem book has my favorite strategy for like if you have no plot, like no idea what you want to do for Nano, of like just writing down all of the things you love in books. Like I like siblings and mazes and witches. So like all of those things you love seeing stuff. Just write down all of those things and see if you can kind of like put anything together and make a story.
I like that idea.
So are you gonna write, Kelly, is your next book gonna be about sibling witches that have to go through a maze?
I hope so.
Because I read that.
I want
I
that
am
book.
totally down for that book. Please write it.
Knowing me, I'll be like, yeah, I've got room for one more. Sure.
It reminds me a little bit of Labyrinth Lost, but not siblings in the labyrinth. Oh yeah, kind of, because she has to go find her sibling. Yeah, okay.
Oh, I gotta stop looking for this link. I'm missing all the discussion stuff. Novels and Tomes asked, how do you figure out if you're a plotter, pantser, or planter, especially if you're writing your first book?
Just try something.
Yeah.
See if it works.
Whatever appeals to you.
Yeah. There was something I've been trying to find this whole chat of like, someone said something I thought was interesting, but I don't know how they said it or who said it, so I can't find it. But it was just kind of like, whether you're plotting or pantsing, you're always doing that other thing. Like if you are plotting out your novel, you're pantsing what's happening while you're plotting. Like it's still, there's bits and pieces. There's no one set way you're doing it. So don't overthink it. Just try to write your book.
And if what you're trying isn't working, try the other thing.
Yeah.
Like,
I
if you try to pants and you get, if you try to pants and get stuck in the same spot every time, try plotting. If you're trying to plot but you never actually start the book, try pantsing. You know.
And with NaNoWriMo, you can I would recommend maybe starting with trying to plot, see if coming out with maybe a more bare bones outline rather than a scene by scene is working for you. If you want to flesh it out a little more because it does feel like it's working, then go for it. But if it doesn't feel like it's working at all, maybe just pick a starting point and an ending point, and on November 1st, see what happens. You can always plot more later.
I do think plotting to some extent increases your chance for success. There's a lot to be said for just writing whatever you want, and you can just write 50,000 words of whatever, but if you want some sort of story to come out of the end of it, it's not going to be perfect. You're going to have to revise it anyway, but knowing even one thing, write down 30 different things that happen. So that's something you're writing every day, so that you have something to go with. because it can be really intimidating on like November 8th, and you're just like, I have no idea what happens, and it's and I could just go watch TV.
Yeah.
Like I was talking about earlier, I've had to stop and spend this whole past week on plotting because I didn't have enough plotting done before I started. So like during Nano, you don't want to have to stop and spend a week figuring out your plot in the middle of the stories. So.
Yeah, I find the blank page is much more intimidating if I have no idea what's going to happen. And especially if you're writing your first novel, I would just start out with a basic plot line and like see if that works for you. Like beginning, middle, end, and some of the scenes in between.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like if you really don't care what you come out with, like I think my first Nano novel was like me and the guy I was dating at the time in a Walmart, and just things happen. And that's totally fine. But
is that available on Amazon, Kelly? Like
I don't think it exists anywhere anymore.
Can you send me a PDF, please?
No.
Can you send me a PDF of anything I asked for?
Yeah. I thought we were friends.
Eons and eons ago.
We had a question from Yuri. This sounds silly, but I feel guilty making bad things happen to characters because I like them and feel responsible for them. I get stuck, but it has to happen to have plot. Advice?
I struggle with this.
Just do it.
I like torturing my characters as much as possible. So I'm the wrong person to ask because I don't feel bad at all.
Pretty much. Yeah, you just have to do it.
Okay, but beyond that, like, it doesn't just automatically come to me of like how to do it. So like,
I gotta say that's what I go in with the best intentions of doing terrible things, and then when I write it, I actually don't come up with those things, and I'm like, they have no real like troubles other than the major plot, like, but they're able to do everything they try to do.
If they have a goal, your job as the author is to foil that goal repeatedly.
Okay, but you can take that, and then a volcano erupts, and the whole town is.
It's hard, and I think what Kelly and I are saying is it's hard for us to do it organically.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Because part of my problem is I'm like, they're trying to do this thing and they need to be able to do it so the plot can keep moving. Like I don't want to disrupt the plot with like, and it's hard for me to figure out a way that like actually moves my plot forward but also stops the characters. I don't know.
Dragons. I believe I've said that before.
That is always
a dragon and they're good.
What if they're good dragons? I like good dragons.
No, Emma, they're not. They're jerks.
No, you guys would be proud of me the other day when I was working on all this plotting. I was like, no one dies in this book. I should kill off a character. So I chose a character to kill off.
Wow. You're turning into Megan over here.
Now kill all of the characters.
I was like, no one loses anything. Someone needs to die.
I actually don't really kill off many characters usually, but in this recent one, I've killed off 3. So.
I usually kill off 1 to 2 major characters and a lot of unimportant characters.
Wow.
I actually killed off a point of view character this book. I was pretty proud of myself.
We had another question. Oh, there was something I was going to say in regards to that last question too. Oh, if you're just struggling with the idea of tormenting them, just like think about the payoff, like the changes to their character arc. Like a lot of times you don't become this amazing hero if you have no struggles at all, because then there's like just no reason for you to move forward and become a better, stronger person. So think of the payoff.
I also like doing something that's especially diabolical. That's like giving my character like a really big fear and then having something happen to them that's like exactly what they were afraid of or related to what they were afraid of. So if one character has a phobia of something, that happens to them essentially.
Yeah, like in the Raven Boys, the main character is very allergic to bees. And so like, he's going to
come to do that in like outside of how the Raven Boys works though, because like in most cases, like you're mundane, like I'm afraid of sharks. There's no way in my life journey this is going to be a problem.
Well, that's very specific. But
if you live next to the beach, it is.
If you went swimming with someone in Hawaii, I don't know. But like with mine, for example, she has a obsession and not phobia, but like anxiety about her breathing because her mom tried to suffocate her at one point when she was little. So later, so later, when the bad guy is like throwing magic at her,
Emma was frozen for her. It just looked like she was having a really good time the whole time. She's just grinning.
So later,
Sorry,
the bad guy is like throwing spells at her, and one of them makes her feel like her breath has stopped, right? Because that's her phobia, and that's what I tapped into. So
Also, Kelly, I have one word for you: Sharknado. That's how. Sharks in your book.
That's an obvious.
Better look
at. You could bring in a shark. What if you're at SeaWorld and you fall in the tank? I don't know.
Because SeaWorld is notoriously careless about leaving their shark tanks.
I've never been to SeaWorld. I don't know. Maybe they were having an off day.
Whoever left that tank open is so fired.
That's something I've always struggled with, though. The like fears that make sense and are dramatic, but then organically incorporating them into a story. Because like the bee thing is that's such a normal fear that makes sense, but anywhere outside of like a forest that imagines your wildest craziness, like that's never gonna be a giant swarm of bees. Like
it happens all the time.
I can think of a lot of scenarios where I could force you to face a swarm of bees.
And I do think that is where comes.
What about
into,
a beard of bees?
You come into like making your like world and your character like fit together, like. You know, like, so like Gansey, like this whole story takes place with them like trekking through the mountains looking for this dead king. And so the thing that could kill him are bees, you know, it's not sharks because they're not near the ocean.
Those forest sharks.
He's not allergic to sharks.
Deadly forest sharks.
Even blue.
No, I'm gonna put sharks in my Nano novel just because we've been talking about sharks so much.
You totally should. Land
or like
sharks.
for a contemporary novel, like making the characters' goals contrary to their fears. So taking the bees example, say like your character's deathly afraid of bees, but they want to be like a National Geographic photographer. You're gonna be in nature around bees.
Or they're afraid of
a shoot with them. Like,
or you could do like afraid of heights or claustrophobia. There's so many situations they could get into where you're like, you have to go into this cave to rescue someone. And you're so scared of the dark. I don't know. Just stuff like that, right?
Or even like fears of failure and stuff. Just like make them repeatedly fail.
I like really existential fears for my character.
Yeah.
You know.
Not bees? Bees wasn't enough for you?
Emma, bees are dying. That's just like epitome of existential.
That's a whole different fear.
I struggle with fears. One thing I do like to do is give your character 2 wants, and they have to sacrifice one in order to get the other.
I like it.
I like that a lot.
That's good. Ooh, I'm gonna write that down somewhere.
So I always have a Word document open during chats as well as my Amazon tab.
That's a good idea.
Someone will say something insightful at some point.
I'm actually writing that down too, because I really like that.
I think I learned this from these chats as much as everybody else, to be honest.
Oh, me too.
I suspect we all do, yeah.
I've read a few really good ones where the character has some kind of like fear or something like along those lines, and there's something to do with the bad guy. You know, he has the opposite, or he is involved with that type of thing, or like the bad guy's made of bees. You know what I mean?
Or like in my book that is finished now, like the character has a really big secret and her foil knows that secret. And so it's just a constant state of like, how do I get them not to reveal my secret? How do I silence them? But it's very difficult to silence a person who is in hiding. So we had another question from Jada. Did you ever have to abandon or radically change your main character because he or she is blocking the plot?
Good question.
I have not. That's my answer. And it sounds like a very difficult situation to be in. So I'm glad I've not been in.
I think I usually change the plot.
Yeah.
more than
You might need to make your character blanking on the word. Like, screw them up more. Like if they're too good at stuff. So,
just make them worse.
yeah,
Give
like
them
if they're
more
solving all your
flaws.
problems, they need to struggle more.
I think I've had that problem for sure in earlier books where it's like, oh, but they're the chosen one, and so they can handle anything I throw at them. And that's always the hardest. I much prefer to have to radically change my secondary characters. But in Nano, again, like if you realize partway through that your character needs to behave a different way, you can just start writing them that way. Like that's future use problem. You can revise them into that mindset later, but like just start once you know what the problem is, just go for it.
I should say I have cut out side characters that are becoming a problem for my main plot, and because like if the main characters are still driving the plot forward properly and everything's kind of unfolding the way it should, and the side characters are somehow like blocking or getting in the way or distracting from, then I will like this one I've cut out 3 side characters because I'm like there's too much going on with these ones and they're kind of distracting more than blocking from the main plot, so I did end up cutting out side ones but not main ones.
Oh, that reminds me of a question. I'm very sorry I don't remember who asked it. I just remember it being like way up there and thinking, that's a really good question. But someone asked a question about plotting subplots. Like how do you plot a novel when you know there are subplots you want to keep involved?
I am doing that right now, and the answer is a lot of pieces of paper. A lot of throwing things away and redoing them, and like for me it's all about like I need to visualize it in like multiple different ways, and it's taken me that's part of why the plot for this book has taken me so long to figure out, and why I've had to write 20,000 words before I've actually figured out most of it, is because there's like all these little side plots that are like tying in together and I'm trying to figure them out. But something that I did this week that's been really helpful is I have like a Word document. I wish I had like a whole like wall in my house to do this on, but I did it in a Word document instead. And I like divided it into like 4 boxes for the 4 different parts of my story. And I've just like done little text boxes with like, you know, 4 words describing a scene, like character confronts this character about this or whatever. And it's a bunch of stuff like that. And then I've color coded them based on what subplot they're part of. And then like kind of arranged them in the 4 boxes. And kind of tried to like make sure that they're balanced. Like it's not like one subplot is all happening in part 2 and then never shows up again. So like trying to like make sure they're spread out and that the order of them is spread out too, that it's not like 5 scenes about one subplot and then 1 scene about another one. So that's helped me a lot, kind of just like, because I needed to visualize it. I realized that was the problem I was having, is that I couldn't figure out like how it all fit together. So. Yeah,
I'm a big fan of color coding for subplots, so I can just like see it.
Yeah.
I do all those things Emma just said, and I also like to figure out like a really explosive ending, because while your subplots may be working kind of not together earlier on in the book, once you hit the climax, that's when like all of the things need to be coming together at once to create just this really intense explosive ending. And so I like to write down like, okay, so this is subplot 1, 2, 3, 4. This is the main plot. So how am I going to bring all of these people into one room together? Like, how do I make this as bad as it can possibly be?
Yeah, it's kind of what I ended up doing. Is like basically like every subplot in some way involves like a secret that the main character doesn't know, and she learns about all of them like right around the same spot in the book, and so she's just like overwhelmed by all these people have lied to me about all these different things. And that's what like leads her to like make this huge decision that like leads to the climax and like messes everything up. So
yeah, we had a question in that same vein. Do you guys have any advice for how to plot out a good 3rd act?
It's hard.
Just make everyone so miserable that you have to take a day to figure out how you're going to get them out of it.
yeah, I would say that like at that like last plot point before you move into Act 3, like your character needs to do something that screws everything up so badly
Mm-hmm.
But it takes
That's
a
the
while
one.
to fix it all.
That's technically called the point of no return or something, isn't
Yeah,
I
or
was
the
just
dark
thinking
night of
that.
the soul.
it?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Or the third
So
plot point.
everything seems the worst.
Yeah.
Mhm.
It's a
It's
giant
the
tangle.
darkest night.
And it's best if your character has
Yes.
caused it.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of my
they're
pet
both their
peeves,
actions.
like my biggest pet peeve in my own writing and other people's is when I get to that like big climax and the main character has not caused the things that have gone wrong.
Yeah.
Like, why did I even read this?
Because if things just happen to the character instead of the character making definite decisions that lead to the climax, it's just really
Oh, I'm trying to think.
And things can happen too, in addition to like the character.
of course.
Your
The first
external-
Harry Potter book. How would he have done that? Like, he didn't set up the basement maze of wonderful things.
He didn't set up the basement.
He
maze
does
of wonderful
make-
things, but he did decide to go into it. and
Yes,
break it.
yeah. He
That's
does
fair.
make decisions all the time that put himself in danger.
Mhm. Yeah. It definitely does depend on like what kind of antagonist you have. I will say that.
Mm-hmm.
Like I don't really have much of an external antagonist in this book, so it's a lot of just my character ruining things. Because she's really angry at everyone and just ruins everything.
Yeah, I mean,
And then has to fix it.
if you have a bad guy like Voldemort, yeah, you're going to have him doing things to people for sure.
Yeah.
But it also has to be your character. Like Harry is like, okay, I'm like 11, but I'm still going to go fight this incredibly horrible bad guy on my own. Like,
Mhm.
It's really more just countering the like. It doesn't necessarily has to be that your character screwed everything up. Because I don't think Harry Potter regrets the decision.
oh no, of course
It all
not.
kind of worked out okay.
Oh, your character doesn't even have to, I don't think, regret anything. Like, even if they did undeniably screw everything up, they'd be like, well.
And I think, like, first Harry Potter book, for example, I think there are things that Harry probably wishes didn't have to happen, like Ron getting hurt in the chess game. Or, like, he gets there and it's like, oh, hope we take the right potion.
That's a pretty good example of like he screwed it up. Of like Cedric would be fine if he'd just been like, I'm taking this.
If he just
If he was more of a jerk.
selfish.
Which
But he
I think
also,
is a
like-
way that the books change as Harry grows up. That he has more of an influence on what happens at the end.
Agency. Yeah.
So I think
Yeah.
I think it does make a difference also with age of characters
Yeah, because
sometimes.
like book 5 is definitely Harry screwed it up.
Yeah.
Oh, for
Yeah.
sure. Yeah. Yeah. Although, like, he does make decisions that affect the plot for good and bad in the long run, even in the first one where he's like, no thanks, Malfoy, you seem like kind of a butthole. And then he makes friends with Ron and Hermione instead. And then he has them to help him at the end when he's playing wizard chess and she's figuring out the potions, like stuff like that, where he still makes conscious decisions.
And
And
I think the first
it
two books, so he
affects-
doesn't really screw it up that much. So eventually it gets to the
No,
point of
yeah,
like, why
no.
does anyone trust him? He's clearly on a roll.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then screws it up badly in later books, yes. Because they get darker, yeah. Well, that's the thing, actually, too, because those books are darker, so I feel like they do have more room for characters to completely mess things up and have a much darker point of no return as well. So.
Yeah, because the older you get, the more you realize when you really mess things up, and like the higher the stakes usually are. I mean, Harry obviously has had high stakes from the beginning, but
Yeah, especially when you get like, I mean, it was high stakes from the beginning, like you said, but like it's even more intense later. So you're going to make bigger mistakes that affect more people. Yeah.
You should just do a whole
Even-
chat on like answering your writing questions based on Harry Potter.
Yeah. It's like all of our chats anyways.
But then it's not
So
off
literally,
topic.
yeah, we just use examples from Harry Potter for every question, and that's our whole chat. Like, well, if you turn to this book on this page,
Right.
here's your
It's like a test the word nerds. Like, ask us any question and we'll see if we can answer
It's
it.
Harry
properly.
Potter.
Squeeze it into the Harry Potter.
What
Yeah.
is this? It's actually be really fun, I think.
We can
Yeah,
probably
it's such an
definitely do that though.
It's such an extensive series, like it's so long and she dips into so many different mythologies and situations and plot lines that it's like, what doesn't it cover?
But it's such a good
Yeah.
example of how to do things right.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah, definitely.
We had another question from Davis Hicks. Thoughts on plot twists? Are they necessary, important, or totally overrated? When/where should you use them? should my character end up needing spray cheese and a shovel? Probably.
The answer to that is always yes. I like a good plot twist.
There should always be some extent of a plot twist. Like, it doesn't need to be like a mind-blowing, I can't believe I didn't see that from the beginning, but something needs to turn on its head.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because the whole point of a story is change. Like, it's about your character changing and their perceptions of things changing, and yeah.
I really passionately love plot twists, like Raven Boys style plot twist. I wish I could do something like that. I love it. Yes.
Like,
it's already taken though. I was like, oh.
My favorite,
I can't write that.
My favorite plot twist is probably catching fire, like in the middle of the book, and she finds out she has to go back. Like, I remember reading that. It was like 2 o'clock in the morning, and I threw my book. Like, I was like, oh my god, why?
See, I was not surprised by that one. I just like knew. I was like, they're gonna go back. Like, I thought it was really obvious. But they
I
kept
wasn't
like,
too surprised by that.
It's the anniversary and something always changes. I'm like, oh, okay, so they're gonna go back.
I never
somehow.
see these
Like,
things
somehow
coming.
Katniss is gonna have to go back.
Yeah, I did not see it coming at all.
Like, so many of our book clubs that will have like that. So who saw this thing coming? And it's never me.
Normally it's not me, but with the Hunger Games one, I wasn't surprised. Same with the book that I read that had a major plot twist, but I saw that coming as well, which was One of Us is Lying. I don't know if you guys saw that.
I haven't read it yet.
I generally knew-ish, but I didn't know exactly how.
Sure.
I think We Were
100%.
Liars was our other big one.
Yeah,
I didn't see that one coming. I
didn't
didn't see it. Yeah. One of Us is Lying and We Were
I consider it a
Liars.
pretty big thing when I don't see a twist coming. So
I would vote Emma our most astute.
Yes, yeah, she picks up on the clues. Yeah. I saw the One of Us is Lying, that one I saw coming, but We Were Liars, that came out of the blue for me.
Yeah, One of Us is Lying. I figured who, but I didn't.
Don't say anything.
As I'm trying
It was still good.
Would
I
that
mean,
be
I
a good
still
book club, or
It's
is it-
really good.
Yeah. It's a good book.
I'm definitely a big fan of coming up with what plot twists are going to be in the plotting phase, though. I'm always a big fan of a really big plot twist, and I think while you can obviously go back and put in the clues and revisions too, I love being able to like write a first draft knowing that I'm about to flip everything on its head, and like people's minds are going to be blown, hopefully, if I do it just right, and I'm going to lay this one clue in here. And it gives me like a lot of motivation to push forward, because it's like, oh, I can drop this clue about who the real murderer is in this chapter.
Like not every book is going to have to surprise readers, but I think something should surprise your character at least. Like, something should be against like their expectations or their view of the world.
Yeah, I love plot twists too, where like the reader knows. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah, that's one of my favorites. Like, that's one of the reasons I wrote multiple point of views this time, because I'm like, I love it when you know something and the character doesn't know something, and you're just like, so much tension. Yes, so much tension.
That's a big aspect of my Nano novel, because it's split point of view between 2 main characters, and like they're both going to do something that like drastically affects the other one, but they have no idea.
I love that. I love it. I especially love stories where you get the point of view of the bad guy and you can see like what the bad guy is doing and how close they're coming to like, it's so good.
Antagonists have feelings too, guys.
Yeah, they do. That's why every character I write is an antagonist.
Villains are my favorite.
Yeah.
I love them.
I don't think I've written a book in years where like my main character was the good guy.
That's something I actually really want to work on with this one, is making my antagonist like, because he's pretty awful, but I would love to make readers feel conflicted about him. Like, oh, I like him in spite of knowing that he's terrible, but I haven't figured out how to do that yet, because he's really terrible.
I also like antagonists that like, they're an antagonist force for the character, but they're actually not like morally good or bad, if that makes sense. Like a lot of AIs are like that. Or like the book I'm writing right now, the magic system is basically the antagonist. So it's the magic, and it's like the cost of the magic that's the like antagonistic force. And like it's not an evil thing. It's just that it's what it is, and the characters have to fight against it, and that's kind of fun to write sometimes.
Like Truth Witch, Susan Denner has talked about how in Truth Witch she wanted to write a book where there were no villains.
Interesting. Technically, no villains. I liked in the Scorpion Rule by Erin Bow, how she did the artificial intelligence, because he was kind of awful, but he was still artificial intelligence, and he was doing what he was programmed to do, and he was also so like quirky, and like the way he talked, that you loved him in spite of.
Sassy computer.
Yeah, he was but like this funny, dry humor, and you're like, I love him even though he's like killing people. Like,
I prefer Aiden because there's no mistake about how he is.
But also at the same time, like, Aiden isn't evil. It's just a mess, like an AI that got damaged.
Yeah, he's an AI who is making choices that humans would not make.
And then you get to book 2 and you like love him. He's wonderful.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I loved him in book 1 too.
That too. Yeah. So
I loved him because I found him fascinating in book 1.
Yeah. Yeah, I will say it's hard having a villain that isn't a villain, an antagonist that isn't a villain. Because I can't just have a bad guy do bad things to my characters in this book, which makes it a lot harder to have like constant conflict.
Yeah. I wonder, like, oh, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just saying again, like you said, like it's hard to have a bad guy that make him, relatable. Because I'm like, well, this guy like goes around killing people. I'm like, what's relatable about that? How do I make people like him? I have no idea at this point.
Well, why is he killing people?
Because he is hunting witches. But the witches are good.
Megan and writers group is like always this of like, how do we make your terrible people likable?
Yeah. Right.
And it usually comes down to like, why are they doing it, and show people
motivation.
Why they are so convinced that they are right, that this is what has to be done.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Isabel, what were you gonna say?
Yeah.
What?
What were you gonna say?
What were you gonna say?
No idea.
Something about bad guys?
Yep. I don't remember. It was something insightful and interesting, I'm sure, but
I'm sure it was really memorable.
It's probably the most insightful thing you were ever going to say.
Yeah, definitely.
Like, you guys screwed it up.
I can never match the insightfulness of that what I was going to say.
I'm going to wonder forever.
No! Well, we've been going for a while, so maybe we can close with this question. It's another one that I'm remembering and can't find. But someone asked if there is a specific plot structure that any of us gravitate to.
It's 4-part.
What'd you say, Kelly?
I have one. I'm just trying to pull the link.
Oh.
You can find 4-part on storyfix.com. So I can just go and tell you that.
What I use is 8 parts. I can't post links, right? I have to give it to Megan.
Put it in the chat here, and I'll put it over in the discussion.
I've used ones with 8 parts before. Maybe it's the same one.
Because I like 4 is so broad. I like having more specific points to hit.
Yeah.
I like 3-act because it's so loose.
Yeah.
That I can just be like, here's the big things I need to know.
But like,
I like how much you have already. Like if you're trying to give yourself more, having more points to hit is useful. If you already have a really good idea of what you want, and then just fitting it into a 3 or 4 act.
I like 4-part for early plotting, like for first drafts, because it's still pretty loose. Like you'd have 5 major like points that you need. Plus, like you kind of have like in part 1, your character should be a wanderer, so figure out what they're doing. Anyway, so it's kind of nice and loose. I like something a little bit more structured for revisions, like 6-part or 8-part, or like Save the Cat. I like all those for revisions when I can get a little more detailed. Sometimes I have trouble figuring out just the like 5 plot points that are in 4 parts. When I'm like first drafting. So
I used to really like. Go ahead.
I say I have a dream of one day writing to the Better Novel Project outline, which is like all the
Yes.
major plot points from Harry Potter, Twilight, and
Hunger Games. Yeah. I try that every single time. Like every single time I outline, I'll read Take Off Your Pants, and then I'll go through the Better Novel Project, and I'm like, I want to do this. And then I try, and I'm like, I can't do this.
Yeah, I can't get that detailed on a first draft until I've written it.
No. I tried the hero's journey because the idea of it really appealed to me, but it ended up being very like mechanical plot. Like it didn't work well.
It's hard to write to those.
Things like that work for revisions. Once you already know what you're doing, you can kind of like figure out how it like fits into it instead of trying to force something.
So I think we'll probably take them too literally. Like they're not supposed to be. This happens. This happens.
Yeah.
I feel like with the hero's journey, that's what happened.
Yeah.
Like, oh, you need a wise man and a quest, and well, no. Chill out.
And it's like once I have a first draft, I can see like, oh, this is what my wise man is, instead of being like, I need to come up with a wise man. You
exactly.
can identify what your book has and doesn't have, and like what you need to strengthen. It's really useful for that, I think.
That's a really good point.
Yeah. I found that the like really detailed the really detailed ones, because I almost exclusively write characters who are antagonists. It's much harder to go by such a step-by-step thing, because for them to get to a point where I really feel like they've won, I basically need them to fail like a lot. And a lot of like the 8-part hero's journey, those things, it's predicated on the notion that your main character is a good person, and it's much harder to come up with a plot when by following that structure. I mean, it's not harder in general, but it's harder to follow that structure when your main character is obviously a bad person who you kind of want to fail.
All right, we're gonna call it.
I think so.
And next week we are back with our final NaNoWriMo prep video talking about just organization and productivity. What did we end up calling it?
Destroying distractions.
So next week's going to be all about just getting things done and getting through November and basically all of the things that I love to talk about. So I'm very excited. Thank you guys so much for joining us tonight. This has been a lot of fun and really interesting, and I'm feeling super inspired to go and plot things right now. So
plot all the things.
Yeah, exactly. Hopefully we will see you guys next week for our next live chat, and as usual, we will have videos throughout the week with more writing goodness, hopefully.
Subscribe.
What?
Subscribe.
Okay. So yeah, thanks so much again, and we will see you next week. Bye.
Bye.